Hi, everyone, and welcome to the DCRO Risk Governance Podcast, where we're focusing on risk governance issues, learning about the work of and receiving guidance from experienced board directors, senior executives, and thought leaders on issues that are important for those governing organizations. My guest today is Noha Georges. Noha is the former Chief Communications Officer and Managing Director for Deloitte, where she led Deloitte's first ever Reputational Risk Sensing Program, a program designed to identify areas of risk exposure, to proactively shape potential risk issues that could negatively impact the firm, allowing firm leadership to adjust their business strategies. Her career journey and that specific program will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Noha.
Thanks, David. It's great to be on with you.
Yeah, and I'm happy to have you here. I've enjoyed the chance that we've had to speak in these recent weeks. And as I learned more about your work, it just seems such an obvious thing to invite you to join us on this podcast. So with that and understanding the importance of communications and what we'll talk about today, would you mind taking us back, give us a little bit more information on your background, and then specifically what took you into a career in communications? And then we'll talk more about the work you were doing at Deloitte.
Sure. So I was actually born and raised in Cairo, Egypt. And early on, even when I was still in college, I was studying business. But then I discovered my love for storytelling and messaging and figuring out like what is the best way to convey a message, a thought. And so for me, that's where I wanted to go. I wanted to just be able to tell a story, to tell it the way it should be told and make it more strategic. And also the one thing that I do, and that helped me quite a bit in my career, is the ability to connect the dots. Because with that, as if you tell a good story, you really need to be able to connect dots and build on a story.
And storytelling is historically, I think before we had things to write on and other ways to record, storytelling was the way in which history was communicated. So it's a gift if you're able to do that well.
Yeah, well, we try. I mean, it's something that you keep on, perfecting and learning and building on. It's not, you really have, it's all about people, and it's all about how people feel and being empathetic and knowing how to communicate with different groups and diverse groups. And I think right now, more than ever, this is a critical aspect of how do you communicate your message? How do you communicate about your brand and reputation? And there are organizations who have really are so well in doing that, and others who still have ways to go.
And so I think in the realm in which you were having to do your communications, I want to jump into this reputational risk sensing program, because that's the thing that when we were talking first got me so interested in your work. You had to talk to some pretty important audiences in that. So can you tell us a little bit about the origin of it? Because it's the Reputational Risk Sensing Program. So it had to have some origin, some purpose. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin of that initiative?
Yeah, sure. So it all started when we had a new CEO at Deloitte. This was like 8 years ago, and he had a big focus on strategic risk. And the biggest thing that we needed to do was move from being more reactive and like reacting to mostly regulatory. Again, Deloitte is traditionally an audit firm. And so there was always the thinking that we react to like regulatory and compliance. But then we had a CEO who was thinking more broadly, how do we become strategic? And so the first thing that he did is that we established our first CRO, Chief Risk Officer, for the firm. And that Chief Risk Officer, which is a best practice, which is what we encourage clients to do, reported directly into the CEO and was on his executive committee. And so once that CEO came in, we wanted to create a proactive strategic risk program. And so we had three key components of this strategic risk program. We had governance, we had reporting, and we had reputation risk sensing. And the governance piece was mostly to elevate the risk function into the organization. So we had a chief risk officer for each of the functions, like where you have a president for each of the functions. We had a chief risk officer for each of the functions that reported into the chief risk officer. And they came in identifying all the risks. We talked about the risks. We had an operational risk committee that met once a month. And we would all meet together and discuss what are some of the risks that need to be elevated, and we tiered them, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, and which ones need to go to the executive committee, which ones need to go to the board, or both. And then we had the reporting, we unified the reporting. And so in terms of how do they report on risk, every function used to do things on their own, and the reporting was not cohesive. So we unified that and brought it together so that the way we are monitoring these risks are the same in every different functions as well as the enterprise-wide. Then we thought, okay, that's great. But there's something that was missing, and that's where I came in. And that's where actually my communications background came in and my curiosity and connecting the dots. I started looking at trends. I started monitoring, and in the beginning, it just started with like social media, traditional media, open source data that was out there, and to see what are some of the trends based on the risks that we have. Where is it heading? How would it impact us? And then we started like building, and it was all manual, just more human insights. And we would present it to the executive committee about like, here are some of the risks that are bubbling up. And then all of a sudden it became, oh, we want to know more. We want more of a deep dive. Then we went back, we actually got a tool that aggregated all this data and put it all together. And it became the human insights plus advanced analytics capabilities to identify, analyze, and monitor emerging risks based on the business strategy.
So did you start to have, I mean, I don't know at the time you were running this how advanced the AI work was, but did you have any kind of AI work helping you filter through all this data? Because you mentioned it started out as a manual
Yes.
process.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, even when it was a manual, I had sort of a beta test of one of the tools that we ended up using. And because you can't really, like, you can't, come up with a trend. You can have an idea, but you want the data to back it up. So yes, we did have a tool, and it's interesting because whenever we talk to clients, it's sort of the black box. A lot of people don't think about how, like, what it is and how it works. They care about what data you enter, because what you input there will determine the output and the analysis. But it was very significant from the onset to explain that a tool on its own cannot be the thing that you would have. You need that human insight and human analysis, because you need someone who actually understands what could be, and again, the connecting the dots, what could potentially become an issue based on a couple of nuggets of information, that a trend that is just emerging.
So starting to put the data in some context that you already know is relevant or that you can introduce.
Correct.
So you talked about this, and I think, we're talking about sort of mini CEOs or CROs or deputy CROs reporting stuff up to the CRO, who's then reporting stuff up to the CEO. It's my understanding, though, that your program actually wound up influencing something that the chair of the board was working on or was thinking about in terms of reputation risk. Can you tell us a little bit more about how it got there and what that was?
Yeah, so this was very interesting. So we had a new chairman of the board who was very, very interested in reputation as a governance issue and not being surprised by events that would come, their way, and all of a sudden it's becoming a much bigger issue, and then you're dealing with it from a crisis perspective versus just some being proactive. The other key one, which I thought was really interesting of how you use sensing, was on succession planning. And succession planning in almost all of the boardrooms is a priority, and it's something that people care about. And the way we did the succession planning was, it's for the elected leaders. That's how we called them. That's the CEO, the chairman, and the global CEO. it's thinking about we gathered sort of intel about when something, a black swan event happening, and when someone was doing succession planning and wanted to see how some organization reacted to it, what were the best practices, who are the ones that we learn from to establish some processes and a framework versus the ones who were caught off guard, and it played out in the media and to their culture and within their organization very badly. So it served as the governance of your reputation and being more proactive so that the board is more equipped to learn about what's happening along with management and be on the journey of an issue that could be evolving, and trying to be proactive in dealing with it, and having the board have governance over how management thinks about that before it becomes a crisis.
And this is, in a way, Deloitte becoming a model for your customers as well.
That's correct. And that's one of the things that we ended up doing. We built this strategic risk sensing we went and talked to clients. We started telling them a lot until this day. The banks, like in FSI and financial services, it's where you see more of the chief risk officers reporting into the CEO more often. But in a lot of other organizations, the CRO is buried, either reporting to the CFO or reporting to into internal audit, and that does not create a program that is more strategic, because you do need your decision makers. You need them to be aware of what are some of the key issues, how they're evolving, and what is being done about it.
Well, and I like the way you talked about it early on, as saying this is in a way evolving from something that was reactive to regulatory issues into something that's more strategic. And we talk about that a lot with other risk people, about the difference between an audit committee at the board, which is really backward looking and validating, and a risk committee at the board, which is forward looking and anticipatory. And anticipatory doesn't mean you're right about guessing the future, but some of it is about how you respond and have you planned to respond. And such a central element to responding to a crisis, or something you'd said, a black swan, is whether you've thought through your communications and how to convey to all stakeholders in your organization how you're dealing with something. So let's talk about that a little bit, in this idea of reputation. Why is it so important for organizations, and why is it important to get out in front of an emerging issue? So rather than just react, why is it important to be out front when something is impacting your reputation?
One of the things that, a lot of organizations do is they start, again, a crisis happens, and then they start flooding the media with statements or making comments or doing all this stuff. At this point, it's too late. At this point, it's too late to really talk about the values that this organization brings, talk about the community involvement, talk about giving back to the communities where we live, work. And you need to be more proactive in terms of identifying what your core values are as an organization, what your core values are to your stakeholders. And if you do that, and if you keep hammering that in terms of, and that's why the sensing is very important, because you see where conversations are going. And you can see sometimes when you look at trends, you can predict where certain conversation will head, and how it might impact you negatively. And you can stay ahead of it by talking to the right folks, by telling them, hey, we recognize that this could be an issue. This is what we are doing to mitigate it. This is what we're doing to make sure it does not happen again. And when you involve people from the get-go, and when you start telling them, this is how we're mitigating this situation, the backlash or the way people think about your reputation is a lot less hurtful. And these, brand impacting events or reputation impacting events become a lot less impactful from a negative standpoint to your brand, because you've already articulated over and over and over your core values, what you bring to your community, what you bring to, to your people, and what your culture stands for.
Well, and a couple of guests we had on earlier podcasts, Michelle Wooker, who's known for her book, The Gray Rhino, talks about some of the psychology of events that are heading at us that we see and why we don't respond to them in groups like the board. And then Michelle Gelfand, who talks about tight and loose cultures and how organizations that are under attack, which can happen if you haven't thoughtfully planned for how to respond to a crisis, they tend to close in. They tend to become much more
Yep.
control oriented and less willing to take risks and innovate. They're in essence circling their wagons to protect themselves. You had talked just a second ago
Mm-hmm.
about brand, or the word brand came in. And I think a lot
Yep.
of people will intermingle brand and reputation or use them as substitutes for each other. But that's not your belief, right? There's a difference between brand and reputation in the perspective that you bring to this. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about the difference and maybe who's responsible for one or the other if it's different?
Yeah, so I believe you're right, they are used interchangeably, and I do believe they are completely different. They overlap, and you hope they would overlap, and I will explain that in a second. But a brand is what you put out to the media, to your stakeholders. It's your values, it's what you want your stakeholders to know what you stand for, what your brand is, what are you known for, and you hammer it in marketing campaigns, in ad campaigns, PR and marketing, and that's really where it normally sits. The brand normally sits with marketing, PR. But to me, a reputation is the perception of how your stakeholders view you. And you do hope that the two of them intersect, and it's a big intersection, and that the brand and the reputation become one. But a lot of times that's not the case, because your reputation is something, it depends on your actions, it depends on how you interact with your stakeholders, how you show up in a crisis, whether it is externally or internally, how your employees and your professionals portray themselves, what your culture is about, and how you manifest that to your outside stakeholders. A reputation, to me, and I do believe it's a governance issue. So to me, reputation is owned by the board. It's not like management cares a lot about the brand, and management has to put framework, and they have to put processes in place to guard against having a bad reputation. But at the end of the day, it's the reputation. You see it more and more these days with a lot of scandals, with a lot of issues that are happening, that at the end of the day, the reputation of an organization lies with the board, and it's the board's responsibility to really, really own it.
Well, brand almost sounds tactical then. Is that a way to differentiate them? Is it sort of reputation is the strategy, although that sounds too contrived to say we have a strategy to have this reputation. But is brand then kind of the tactical
It is.
implementation? Okay.
Yeah, it is. The brand is, and you absolutely need your brand, because you need to build your brand and your brand permission to be a voice in the industry and be the thought leader on the issues that you are trying to portray. But the and it's a lot. It's in you. It's within your control in a way. Reputation is you want to put enough frameworks, and you want to put enough things in place to make sure that you're guarding your reputation. And to me, there's a big distinction between the two. It is reputation is very, very strategic.
Well, I think this is really important because I want to go back to the comment you made that reputation is perception. If
Mhm.
you ask people, they'd often say that an organization earns its reputation by what it does. So, in essence, that's a feedback to people. But one
Yes.
of the things that I think is really underappreciated, and I've actually argued is more important than feedback, is this concept of feed forward, which is related to what we're going to do in the future in terms of a relationship with an organization. And as we talked about earlier, risk is something that has to be anticipatory. So it's in essence feeding forward. And if I want to make a decision about whether I'm going to work for your company, whether I'm going to lend money to your company, invest in your company, engage you in some sort of a long-term contract, all of that is forward-looking. So it has to be something that is based on my perceptions, which makes reputation even more important. I think is really reaffirming of your idea that reputation is owned by the board.
Yeah, and to add on that, you're absolutely right. For me to add on that is then you move now, you actually then evolve. And so you move from anticipating, you move from proactive versus reactive to predictive, right? And that's a completely different. So think of it this way. Think from COVID standpoint. With COVID-19, it has completely and utterly disrupted the supply chain. And one of the things that, and even with technology disruptions, like with Zoom or Microsoft Teams or any of the video programs, think of it that with having sensing, you can also start predicting trends that could be needed. We always say that sometimes the customer does not know what they don't know. They don't know what they want because they, like the art of the possible, they don't know what they don't know. And it's the sensing takes it to a next level of predictive risk intelligence, which is more of, okay, I have these risks. Some of them, yes, I'm trying to be proactive and making sure that they don't become a crisis, over time. But also, how can I utilize some of these disruptions and some of these new technologies to my advantage to build on my strategy and adjust my strategy? And this is one of the things so we had a tagline. Again, I'm a communications person. So we had a tagline for our risk program. And the way we said it is that risk is a strategic enabler. Everything we say risk is a strategic enabler. So it's strategic, not just in terms of identifying risks and monitoring them, but it's also identifying new trends that could become an opportunity or could become a risk if we do not, or a disruptor in a negative way if we do not pay attention to it.
Yeah, that's a really important way to frame it, because we really want people to be understanding that risk is necessary, risk taking is necessary, enable for organizations to achieve their goals and to live on, but to empower people to make their business decisions better. And I think that's what you were capturing in that. So
Yep.
let me go to the work. A couple of the key objectives of the DCRO are to get organizations to establish risk committees at the board level, and then also to bring people onto their boards who we would call qualified risk directors. So not people who are just control or loss focused. They're really focused on how to use risk in the way in which you just described it. In the case of a risk committee, we like lots of diversity in the composition of that particular committee. Is there a place on a board risk committee for someone who has a skill set in reputation risk? And maybe I'm giving you a softball question, a self-serving question, but let's think about what we've just talked about here from a strategic standpoint. Is the risk committee the place where you would put someone who has that skill set?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we did. So I was part of the strategic risk and regulatory. Ours was risk and regulatory committees. I sat in every single meeting. I was given time slot, even if it's just dependent on where things were and whether we're at a heightened level of risk issues that we need to discuss, or we're just being proactive that here are some of the trends that we're monitoring. But I was a permanent member of the management, sitting in the strategic risk committee, reporting to the board and telling them what we're looking. And we would give them a one-page, it was literally one page, because the board has so much to look at and so many things to worry about. And we would give them, here are the key trends, here are the key issues. And it was the enterprise wide level, the ERM. Oh, and within the functions, if there are a couple of areas that we need to focus on specific to the functions. And it was very short and sweet. It was something to just let them know. And if they start asking, more questions and they want to deep dive into some of these issues, we would prepare a report and give it to them with all the details and how we came to that conclusion of what we are anticipating, of what is happening, where the conversation is going.
Well, and I won't pick on any companies that are in the headlines right now because somebody may be listening to this 2 years from now. But I have to believe that there are a lot of board members who are going to hear this conversation who wish they had something like you've just described. I mean, it's something that, to me, sitting on a board, when I'm trying to think about this, this future that is highly uncertain and incredibly dynamic right now with all the technological changes, what I don't want to be is derailed by a reputational issue that we either hadn't seen coming or didn't know how to respond to. So, given that, and thinking about those people who are listening to this right now, what guidance would you give to a board member who's saying, I wish I had this where I serve? Where do they start? And what guidance would you give them in terms of implementing a reputational risk sensing program?
Well, the first thing I would ask is look at your, again, they call it like ERM. A lot of people are still having that enterprise risk management, and they ask for the risk reporting once a year or maybe twice a year. And for us, it was once a month where we get the reporting. So start asking management, what are the things what's the mechanism that, how are you identifying those risks? Are you getting the right people? The other thing that I didn't mention is that we had a strategic risk committee. So the operational one with CROs, the strategic risk committees was the chief strategy officer for each of the functions who reported to the president of that function. We met with them on a quarterly basis to confirm that from a strategic standpoint, these risks were the right risks to focus on. So the biggest thing is, you need to ask, is your chief risk officer well positioned within the organization? That's the first question. Or are they behind like 2 or 3 or 4 layers that you're not getting the information that you need? And it's like they need to think that the reputation is a board issue. It's a governance issue. And if they don't, and most people only start thinking about that when you're in crisis. When you are in crisis, it's too late. And that's why we also had, like in the crisis communications, when you're in a crisis and you wanted to talk to people, we had the person, well, at the time it was me, who sat on the committee of the key people in a crisis to talk about, okay, here's where we are. This is what's happening. How do we change the conversation? So it's, you just need to ask management, where do they position the CRO? Because that's extremely important. Are they focused on the right risks? And are we being proactive? Or is this only focused on crisis?
And I think that, when you and I had talked before, one of the things that you had emphasized is this notion of wargaming within the boardroom. And I have a feeling that people who are listening to us today, if they want to test whether they're ready, that would be a great place to start to find out whether they really have thought through this. They may think they have, but as soon as you start putting a true war game with a credible scenario to it, you'll find some of these weaknesses. So I think then again with these podcasts, I consider myself to be pretty close to 100%. I'm not going to offend anybody, but in terms of the guests I've had on here that I want to talk to more in every conversation. So we've filled our 30 minutes, but I think you've given people an awful lot of incentive to be looking at how their board's handling reputation, whether they do see it as a governance issue. I think that's really important mindset to take into it. And this idea that you've differentiated brand as a tactical issue from that also puts this communication idea into a different framework. So Noha, thank you very much. I really am glad you joined us today, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you as we do our respective work.
My pleasure, David. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.